afternoon. Welcome to Sociology 1. So as I recall, we finished up with our first table the other day. So I'm now ready to review a little. I think I'll post these notes after today. If I don't, send me an email to remind me. That means I forgot. But we're done with part of it. Well, we will be done soon with the first part of the course. So you'll see here, these are the notes you're going to get. If you need any right now, maybe now is a chance to fill in. But we covered the sociological imagination, social structure. Actually, we didn't really talk about structuration. I need to maybe fill that in at a certain point. And then we got into what is sociology, and we started with this table. And now you should have this table in your notes, talking about the three founding fathers, Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. We did get all the way through this, did we not? Now we're ready to talk about the three main perspectives in sociology. And one of my main reasons for introducing you to Marx, Weber, and Durkheim and going into some depth about their concerns is really to help you understand the next point, which is about these three main perspectives. So that's our topic today, is the three main perspectives in sociology. I think what I'll do is, instead of using my bad handwriting, I'll try to use this table. But I'm going to try to do it in a way where I'm kind of scrolling through it as we go. So hopefully that's not too weird of a way to do it. But this is the first row of the column that I want to draw with you today. And, oh good, the people at home don't need to see me. I got all this chalk on me, and then I tried to wipe it off with water, and it just made it all worse. Anyway, so... well, first of all, maybe this isn't going to work all that well. Maybe I'll just show you the whole thing. These are the three main perspectives: conflict theory, functionalism, and symbolic interactionism. And actually, maybe, I haven't tried it, but maybe this overlay pen software would be a good thing to use here. So, conflict theory, functionalism, and symbolic interactionism, those are the three main perspectives in sociology. And that's what we're going to start comparing today, and thinking about how they're similar and different. And if you begin filling out this table, it pretty much has all the things from chapter 1 that I would ask you to know, along with the key terms and what we talked about in lecture. But I feel like the first chapter kind of goes quickly over a whole bunch of stuff, and if I were reading it, I wouldn't, and I was my first year in sociology, I'm not sure I would know what was important and what wasn't, and at least for my instructor. And I'm helping you see what I think are some of the key ideas. And I think it helps to try and get it in a compact sort of form. So let's first talk about the founding fathers. You already know the first person listed for each one of these. Marx is the founding father for conflict theory, Durkheim for functionalism, Weber for symbolic interactionism. Your textbook mentions a few other people, and as I said earlier in this class, the term founding fathers is a misnomer. It wasn't just men writing the earliest forms of sociology. And it wasn't just white men. And for a long time, the field of sociology only seemed to remember Marx, Durkheim, and Weber as people who helped to found the field. But in more recent decades, people have been going back and trying to remember some of the people that were there at the founding of sociology. When it comes to conflict theory, let's talk a little bit about W.E.B. Du Bois. What do you know about W.E.B. Du Bois? He's actually one of the more famous people in our list. In some ways, he's more famous than Durkheim and Weber, at least here in the United States, because Du Bois was an American. But what do you know about W.E.B. Du Bois? Anybody? You also should be reading chapter 1 already, and they talk about him in there. So if you've never heard about him before this class, you did in chapter 1, but maybe you haven't read chapter 1, but you need to be. Anyway, W.E.B. Du Bois was the very first African American to get a PhD from from Harvard. He was the founder of an organization I'm sure you've heard of, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He was one of the founders of that. So he, like Marx, was a political activist for much of his life and a newspaper editor. but he was also a scholar that got a PhD from Harvard, the top school in the United States, and one of the first sociologists ever, but certainly one of the first in America. And I want to think of him as a contributor to conflict theory. Your textbook sort of puts him in that category as well. Marx, as we're going to learn, mainly the main conflict that he observed and thought was important, and we're going to talk all about Marx's thought, was class conflict. Marx felt that if you want to make your life better, you really need to, especially if you're a working person, you need to join together with other working people and fight for the improvement of working people. So Marx thought race was a false dividing line, that white workers and black workers should get over their racial differences and join together as workers and fight for better conditions. So Marx thought that race was kind of a made-up thing. It was a convenient belief for the leaders of society. As long as workers are fighting each other about race, then they're not fighting the top class in society. So Marx said race doesn't really matter. Forget about race. Focus on who you are as a class, what class you're a member of, and if you're a working person, your other people on your team are other working people, regardless of their race. And Du Bois, being an African American person, said, well, I agree with Marx that class is the most important fight, and black people are never going to be free until working people in general are free. And Du Bois certainly understood that. But Du Bois also said, black people aren't going to be able to join the working class movement as long as there's racism. White people won't let us join their unions. White people won't let us be part of their clubs and societies. So it's one thing to tell black people to forget about race and join the working movement, but white people haven't forgot about race, and they're often excluding us and holding us back. So Du Bois argued black people need to come together as a race, fight for the end of racism, better treatment of black people in the society. And once they've achieved that, then they'll be in a better position to join the working class movement and fight for better treatment of all working people. So Du Bois added the idea that if you're going to understand conflict in the modern world, you can't just look at class conflict the way Marx does. You also need to take racial conflict into account. And another person on here is Harriet Martineau. If you're at home, I'm over here on Martineau. Here, I think you can see that, yeah, little pencil. Her first name is Harriet, and your textbook mentions her, and she was somebody also writing what's called social theory, writing about society and trying to theorize what was wrong with society and what would make it better, around the same time that Marx was and Du Bois was, the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And Martineau, being a woman, you might guess, argued that gender was another source of conflict. Well, really sex was a source of conflict. Men and women, males and females being unequal in the society. And you may well know that females were much more unequal to males back then than they are now in terms of things like voting rights and property ownership and jobs and things. And there again, Marx argued, well, you women need to join together with working class people because women are even more oppressed than working class men, because women who stay home and take care of men, they're helping companies make money. When a man goes to work at a factory all day, he's helping the boss become rich, and that boss is exploiting that worker. But what about the woman who stays home and takes care of the children in the house and the food? She's getting paid zero by capitalism. But she's helping the capitalist become rich because that man working for him wouldn't be able to work hard and make money if he wasn't well taken care of at home. So Martineau argued women are like slaves in the capitalist system. They stay home and work all day and they're getting paid nothing and they're helping the system make money. So she argued we can't just forget about exploitation of women. It's its own form of exploitation. And we can't just join together with men and fight for workers to get better pay and better treatment because we're still getting mistreated at home. And sometimes men won't even give us the money they make. They take it and go spend it at the bar, or who knows where they spend it, but they're not coming home and giving it to the wives and the children. So a lot of women said, women need to come together as women, and Martineau was one of those things. Women need to come together as women and fight for better treatment of women in the home, and then later for things like jobs and voting and things like that. But it's not something we can just pretend doesn't exist. There is inequality between men and women need to fight together as women for that for equality, not just fight together with workers for worker equality. So all three thinkers are talking about conflict in society. Marx focused on class conflict, Du Bois on race conflict, and Martineau more on gender conflict. But that's why you can kind of all group them in as early founders and contributors of conflict theory. Durkheim, as we saw, is the founding father of functionalism. And there again, there were other people who helped to found it. Not necessarily non-white men. Well, there were, but I didn't list them on here. But Merton is really a later functionalist. Robert Merton, we'll talk about him later when we talk about functionalism. But he wrote more in the 20th century. As we'll see about functionalism, functionalism is a little bit simplistic. As we're going to see, functionalism sees society as being like a machine. We're going to talk about that in a second. But if you're a functionalist and you see society as a machine, then you think everything needs to be there. That if it's there, it must have a function and it must serve a purpose in society. So if something exists in society, it must be good. And so functionalists can be a little simplistic that way, thinking that if something exists, it must be a good thing that it does. And how do you be a critical functionalist? How do you say, well, sometimes things get created that aren't good and we need to get rid of them? So Merton was somebody who helped make functionalism a little more sophisticated, a little more mature, not such a simplistic, rosy picture of how things work in society. And so we'll talk more about Merton later when we talk about things like latent functions and strain and stuff like that. Symbolic interactionism, we're not really going to even get to that until after the first exam as a perspective, but Weber is the founding father of that, as he was always asking about, well, what does life mean to people? And if life is meaningless, then people are not going to be happy. So he's not just interested in, do people have enough money? Do they have a purpose in the society? They also, need a meaning to their lives. And so he's more interested in the meaning of things, the symbolic meaning of things for people. And Mead, George Herbert Mead, is a famous anthropologist. And he's not usually considered a sociologist, but he helped to develop the symbolic interactionist perspective, because one thing he argued was individual people, you can't really think of individual people separate from society. In other words, when you say you have a self, your self is created already by things like language and other social things. So it's not like you are a self separate from society. We are already social beings from before we even come out of the womb. We are already shaped by society, and who we are is a function of society that we're part of. So Mead is a contributor to this symbolic interactionist perspective. I'm not going to have a lot to say about Mead after today, but your textbook talks about him, and so that's where I'm putting him, as one of the people that helped develop this symbolic interactionist perspective. More interesting question. Here's where I wish you didn't see the answers already, because I like to usually ask right now about this one, society metaphor. What is a metaphor, first of all? When I say society metaphor, this is one of the easiest ways when you're trying to think of, wait, what is functionalism? What is symbolic interactionism? What's conflict theory again? I remember those words, but I don't know what they mean or how they're different. Well, if the only column in here that you really get is this one, then you'll really get the essence of what these different perspectives are all about. So what, and your textbook doesn't really talk about their society metaphor. It's an idea I'm kind of adding. But what is a metaphor? Anybody in here take an English class?
Comparing two things without using like or as.
You're getting technical. Yeah, similes are when you use like or as, like you are just like the moon or something. That's a simile, not strictly speaking a metaphor. But a metaphor is when you just compare something to something else. My love is a red, red rose, or, the world is a ghetto, or I don't know what songs you like. But a lot of poets, use metaphors. And sociologists do too, because sometimes when we're talking about society, it's useful to compare it to something else. Most of the time, when you take social studies, if you take an introductory type of sociology or social science, and you're in high school and they teach social studies, or elementary school, or cops. I like to think cops are pretty functionalist in their way of looking at things. So if you were to take an AJ class, Administration of Justice, they probably teach a kind of functionalist perspective where they pretty much compare society to being like a machine. what does that mean to say society, I'm using a simile, society is like a machine, but if you said society is a machine, why would you compare society to a machine? In what ways is a society like a machine? And here I'm going to use a good old-fashioned whiteboard. But
every part or thing has a purpose to lead to something bigger, I guess.
Okay, so machines are made up of parts.
Yeah.
And each part does what? Each part has a function in the overall system. And so if you are looking at a machine, you're trying to figure out what does each part in that machine do. I actually prefer the term organism. What's an organism as a machine? Well, an organism is a biological machine. It's a machine but made out of, cells and stuff rather than metal. So if we were going to compare society to an organism, well, what we're saying is they both have parts. That's what you said. There's parts to an organism and there's parts to a car. Well, actually, in a machine, there's parts. What do we call the parts of an organism? In a machine, we call them parts. In an organism, we call them what? Organs. So you can say that an organism has organs. What does a society have? When we say society is made up of parts, well, the term that functionalists use, and we're going to be using a lot this term, is institutions. And by the way, the people at home can't see what I'm writing, so if there's a way we could get a shot of the board, then they'll see this too. There we go. So you can compare society to being like a machine or an organism. They both have parts that make them up. And each part has a function, but you can go further and you can say that just like an organism has parts that make it up, the society has equivalent parts. So for example, what would we say is one of the most important organs in a human body, let's say? Human body is an organism. You've all taken basic biology, I'm sure. You wouldn't be in this room. So what would be like one of the most important organs in the human body that the body couldn't run, couldn't function without that part? Heart is an important one. I'm going to go with brain, though. Let's start with brain. What is the brain's function? Why do you need a brain? Some of us don't seem to function well without them, or not so well, but what is the function of the brain? It coordinates all the other parts. So can you think of, in a society in America, is there somebody somewhere or something somewhere whose job it is to coordinate all the other parts of American society?
President.
Government, yeah. So you could say government is like the brain that makes sure all the other parts are in place and doing their job. Why did I abbreviate? Why did I not going to an abbreviation? All right, well, let's take the heart. The heart's another important organism. Organ? What's the heart's function? Wait, he said heart. What's the heart's function?
Transportation network.
Yeah. Why? The heart's function is to circulate blood, and blood carries what? Nutrients and other forms of information around the body. So you could say, like, transportation system is like the heart, or maybe also our communication system. I would say transportation and communication make up the heart of our society, so we can all communicate with each other. Maybe nervous system would be in there somewhere too, as part of the transportation and communication. What other organs are there in the human body, and can we find their equivalents in society?
Lungs.
Huh?
The lungs.
Lungs, what is the function of the lungs? I'm not sure what we'll put for this one.
Breathing.
Breathing, that's the function. Is there an equivalent in a society?
Yeah.
What?
Cash flow.
Huh?
Cash flow.
Cash flow, well, I'm going to use yours. I like to use the digestive system. So what is the digestive system's function? That's the teeth and the mouth and the esophagus and the stomach and the intestine and all the way down to the duodenum and the anus and all that. I should have been in biology, huh? I'm enjoying talking about anuses. Anyway, what is the equivalent in the body? Well, I would say not cash flow, but maybe the economy. The economy takes raw materials, chews them up, turns them into products. Those products are sold for money. Money is what fuels our society, just like energy is what fuels a human organism. What about the immune system? What's the function of the immune system?
Keep us out.
Protect us from... Why do you have antibodies? Why do you have white blood cells? Why do you have that kind of stuff?
Fight off that.
Fight off outside threats. Do we have an institution in society that fights off foreign threats?
Military.
Why is it the same three people? I'm giving you guys softballs. These are questions you probably answered in 4th grade. I'm pretty sure my 4th grader can answer them. So like if you have to participate and the professor's asking you a really easy question, like what is the point of the digestive system, you probably should raise your hand. But sitting there looking like I'm talking in a different language is probably not what I'm doing. But anyway, immune system, so is there something in society that fights off, makes sure we don't get attacked by foreign threats? In society?
Oh, in society, yes, the military.
Okay, military and law enforcement, you could say. So I like to think of this as a simplistic way of thinking. That's why I'm surprised you're just not answering questions, some of you who never raise your hand or not raise your hands here either. But the point is this should be easy because you've probably been taught this before. You've probably been taught in social studies that you can think of society as like a big part. What about a big machine with different parts? And oftentimes we're taught this when it comes to the family. People often say the family serves an important function in society, and we've got to have families. Could you compare the family to a different organism? Now I'm asking for the organism or system of organisms, systems of organs, not just your DNA. Well, what is the point of DNA and how is it?
Or it does the way you're carrying energy.
Yeah, so you have a family. So in society or in your body, what is the thing in your body that does what the family does for society? Or why do we need DNA? Or what do we do with our DNA? Why is our DNA so important?
For reproduction.
Reproduction. In other words, you want to pass on your DNA. That's why DNA wants to do, is be passed on. And how does it get passed on? With a reproductive system, with, testes and ovaries and all that, and penises and vaginas. And so you could say the family's job is to reproduce society. If families don't have kids, then we won't have a society. If they don't teach their kids all the rules and rights and wrongs and stuff of society, then we won't have a functioning society. So like I said, a lot of times cops will say, oh, if you don't have a family, you're not going to function right, and that's why we have crime, too many kids running around without families, or, it's very common to hear police and other people in charge of a society think of it in terms of a system, a machine, and everybody's got their part in the machine. And functionalism is a perspective that's very common among people in charge of a society, like the government and the police and the other people whose job it is to make sure things run smoothly. They want to think of something else that runs smoothly, like a machine, and compare society to that. But I think of that as a little simplistic. Like when I teach my 8-year-old, when she asks, what do you do, Daddy, for a living? I say, teach sociology. And she'll say, well, what's sociology? And I'll say, well, we study society. And she'll say, what is society, Daddy? And I'll say, well, society is kind of like a machine. It's like this, kind of like your body. We have a heart and a head and all those things, and society has those too. But all the while I'm thinking, well, that's kind of simplistic. That's not what I teach my 18-year-olds and my 28-year-olds. Because is it true that society is one big machine where we're all working together smoothly for the good of the whole? Sometimes there's conflict. Sometimes society is a little bit more like a football game. And a football game, like with the 49ers and the Raiders, are they working together so everyone has a smooth, good time on the football field? What are they doing? One's trying to run the other one into the ground. In other words, one team's gain is another team's loss. It's a turf battle. And as this team pushes forward into this team's territory, it's moved back. And it's a zero-sum game where this one's gain is this one's loss. So conflict theorists tend to see society more like a football game, and they're more looking at, well, what are the different teams? Who's fighting who? in this conflict. And like we said, some see it mainly as a fight between different social classes, like the upper class that owns the land and machines and everything, versus the people who have to work for them. Some people see it more as a race conflict between different racial groups from different parts of the world that are fighting each other for dominance. Some see it as more of a conflict between genders. There's different ways you could put it, but to think of society as one big thing, one thing that's all working together, well, if you're in charge, that's a useful way to look at it and tell everybody do your part, get in line, do what you're supposed to do, get with the program. You'll often hear coaches say that, or parents say that, or teachers say that, or presidents say that. But what if you're not the head? What if you're the working people, or the non-dominant people, or the people who are subject to people's power? From your perspective, it looks more like a football game. Well, you guys are in charge now, but I wish I was in charge, and we are not seeing eye to eye. We are seeing things from different perspectives here, and we are in conflict with one another. And so the metaphor you use, so conflict theory is a perspective that's a little more attractive to people who find themselves not dominant in society. If you find yourself being, a non-dominant group or race or class or gender in a society where you aren't the ones with all the power, then you might think of things as a little bit more conflict-ridden, and you might be more interested in the kinds of questions that conflict theorists ask about why society is the way it is and what's going on in the society. So in some ways, functionalism and conflict theory are like opposite perspectives. Functionalism looks from the top down at a society that should be running smoothly and hopefully is running smoothly and everyone doing their part. Or it's looking at things from the bottom up and saying, well, no, this is a more conflict thing where some people are dominating others and controlling others, and other people are fighting to be free of their control and domination. And so and there's similar perspectives too, in that functionalism sees society as a system, and conflict theorists too tend to talk about it as a system. It's just a system controlled by certain people in order to control others. So you often hear conflict theorists talk about the capitalist system as if it was a big machine, and you'll hear functionalists talk about our society as if it was a big machine. It's just that these conflict theorists are looking more at the little guys in the machine, and these guys are looking more at the people running the machine. Anyway, so that's those two perspectives. And the third one is kind of off in its own world in some ways. You can also compare society to a play. Have you ever heard anyone compare society to a play? Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, famous playwright. Does anyone know what he said when he compared society to a play? You don't know that quote?
All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players.
Excellent. From which play?
I don't remember.
Tempest. So anyway, that's a famous quote from Shakespeare, that all the world is like a stage and all the men or women are merely players, meaning actors and actresses. Not what today's kids mean by players, but I think today's kids mean a similar thing, in fact. People say playa nowadays. They also say things like front. Oh, he's fronting like he's a playa. He's fronting like he's a gangster. Well, this whole idea of fronting is very much the idea that we aren't being who we really are when we're interacting with other people. We're being who we want other people to think we are. And we're oftentimes hiding a lot of who we really are when we're interacting. Symbolic interactionism is all about interaction, people interacting. And so even right now we're acting like when a professor tries to make a joke or something and you all giggle like it was funny. You didn't right there. But that wasn't funny. But why do you laugh when it's not funny? Because what would happen if you didn't? What happens when a person says something they think so funny and all the people are like, no, it's not funny. What happens? It's awkward. And you get uncomfortable when it's awkward. And you start to sweat a little. And your hand went over your face. When we're awkward, we don't want to show our face. We don't want to be on stage anymore. No one look at me. I don't want to be on this play anymore. So it'd be easier to pretend that it was funny and just giggle when somebody made a joke, because then it's not awkward. And then we're just in our play. And we didn't. Or what do you do when you're walking down the street and you trip?
Play it off. What
do you do if you see somebody trip? Do you point and go, aha? That's what Nelson Muntz does on The Simpsons. I keep bringing up The Simpsons. But if you, here's a typical thing. Somebody trips, and what's the first thing they do? If you're walking down the street by a cafe and there's a bunch of people outside, and you trip and all your books go flying, what's the first thing you might do?
Look to see if any.
Look up. You look up. What did they see? That's the very first thing you're going to do, because you want to know, did they see it? If they didn't see it, then what? If everyone's still just talking, then I just quickly get my books and I go on. My knees are bleeding, I'm in terrible pain, but nothing just happened. And what about the people who actually did see you? They did see you. It was hilarious. But you looked up, so they went back to their... I was just talking to you. We weren't seeing that idiot, did we? We're drinking coffee. Stupid idiot over there. In other words, if I saw you and you see me seeing you, then I have to interact with you. Then I have to go, oh, I'm sorry, Mondays suck. Can I help you with those books? But if I didn't see you, then it didn't happen. Then I don't have to help you. You don't have to be embarrassed. We can just go on. And so a lot of times we're acting. That's just a little example of how people in their everyday lives are pretending things to be true that aren't true, so that you can get through your day, so that you can keep on going with social reality. But we do this all the time in a whole bunch of ways. And a lot of who we say we are is really just a role we're playing in a given moment. I'm pretending I'm a professor right now. You're pretending you're students right now. You're pretending you're paying attention. You're pretending you're in class. But really, your mind is on your boyfriend, or how you wish you had had more lunch, or what am I going to do tonight? There's all kinds of things going on in here right now besides the class happening. But for appearance's sake, and because we happen to literally be on screen here, we pretend like we're in class and doing what we're supposed to be doing. So people are much more complicated than they appear, because there's a lot more to them than in that given moment what they're pretending to be or pretending to play. And so symbolic interactionists tend to see it that way. And symbolic interactionism, to really understand the difference from the others, we have to go to scope. It's a micro perspective. Macro means big. And symbolic interactionism is the only micro perspective here. When we say big, macro, we're talking about large scale in terms of size and chronology. In other words, when a functionalist says they're studying society, well, let's take a conflict theorist. If you ask a conflict theorist, what is society? You say you're a sociologist that studies modern society. Well, what is modern society? And a conflict theorist would say, modern society is the capitalist system. Well, how big is that? Well, it's the whole planet. So how many people in it? Like 6 billion or something like that? And how long has it been around? Well, around since like 1492, when Columbus started sailing the ocean blue, is when the capitalist system started coming into being. So we're talking about a 500-year span that covers the whole globe. That's a big thing, called the capitalist system. That's macro. Functionalists don't necessarily see society as being the whole capitalist system. Functionalists tend to focus on singular countries. So functionalists might look at American society, or French society, or Indian society, or English society. It's still a big thing, because if you're talking about American society, you're talking about something that's 250 years old and encompasses 350 million people or so. So you're talking about a very big old thing. Even if you don't focus on the whole society, a lot of functionalists focus on a single institution, like they might be a sociologist who studies the education system, or, and we didn't put that up on our list, or who studies, that's part of reproduction, or who studies the family, or who studies economic sociology, or political sociology, so that you might just focus on a specific institution if you're a functionalist, but if you did, you're still looking at something quite large. Like the education system in America, the public education system's been around like 100 years, and it encompasses millions and millions of people. So those are big things. Symbolic interactionists, though, if you ask them, well, what are you studying when you study society? Well, we're studying interaction. So what's interaction? Well, anytime two people are together, they're interacting, so just two people is enough for an interactionist. So interactionists tend to study small-scale things, like two people talking, or like a classroom. An interactionist could say a lot about the interaction going on in this classroom, like who speaks and who doesn't, who raises their hand or who doesn't, Who does the professor call on more? Like, does the professor call on males more than females? Does he call on people sitting up front more than people sitting in the back? How close people stand to each other is even a symbolic form of communication. There's a lot of ways that people interact symbolically. Even if you're not speaking right now, you're interacting with each other and with me symbolically. How are you interacting symbolically right now, even if you're not speaking? Well, your body, no, how are you communicating? Not just listening, but how are you sending messages right now? Even if you're just sitting there. Well, your body is a message sender, so how you hold your body, the gestures, the way you carry yourself are all sending certain message, whether you want to be or not. Like you might be really tired, and that's why you're holding your hand. I can't keep my head up. It's much more comfortable. But what does that communicate? It communicates boredom, tiredness. So you might want to slap yourself up if you want to communicate something else. But also, how else? Besides your body and your posture, what else is communicating right now?
Particular item you have in your hands?
The things you hold. What about what you're wearing? Your clothes you're wearing? Your hairstyle, the choices you've made about how to wear your hair and how to wear your clothes and what your clothes are, the color of your clothes, the things on your clothes, the amount of money you spend on your clothes, or at least want people to think you spent. All these are things that you're communicating just by sitting there. And so symbolic interactionists say there's a whole lot you can learn about human beings just by watching them, observing them, interacting in small groups. So symbolic interactionists tend to focus on that. And they don't usually pay much attention to history. They're usually looking at what's going on right now in a society. And that's one strength, but also maybe a weakness of that perspective. And all these perspectives have strengths and weaknesses. Their foci, this is the question of, well, what do they study? If you go around calling yourself a conflict theorist or a functionalist or a symbolic interactionist, and by the way, do people really use these terms when they're not always? I mean, in real life, if you're a sociologist, you probably draw on different ideas from different perspectives, but there's usually some sort of primary loyalty you have. And sometimes departments of sociology are in a lot of conflict with each other over which one is the quote-unquote right one. But you guys don't need to decide this yet. I mean, I remember the very first sociology job I applied for was at Cal State Long Beach. And they gave me a phone interview. Before I got to go there and meet them, they were calling people on the phone and interviewing them. So it was like 5 people, I think, on their committee that I was talking to. It so happened that I had a fever that morning. It was like 102. I'm like, maybe I should like postpone this interview. But I went through with it. And one of the questions they asked me is, well, what type of sociologist are you? In other words, what? I don't know how to get this screen back on, but
Peter went to rest.
oh, that went to the. Oh, okay.
You're a risk taker for having that man open.
Oh, good point. I end up getting on my clothes first. But actually, this is not a Sharpie. But actually, these. Anyway, I don't know why that's not. Maybe it's another one. So they were asking me what kind of sociologist I was, and I had this fever, and I was thinking I didn't know how to answer it. What I said was, well, it really depends on whatever the research question I'm studying. If, sometimes I need a conflict theory perspective, sometimes a functionalist, whatever is most appropriate for the research question. And as soon as this was coming out of my mouth, I was thinking, well, they're never going to hire me. Because what they really want to hear is you to take a strong position on which kind of sociologist you are and defend it. They don't want a namby-pamby answer where you just say, it's all good. And that was kind of the answer I gave them. They did hire me, so I guess they liked that answer. But that's the answer I kind of give to sociology students is don't decide now which one you are. Don't be prejudiced. I mean, they all have their strengths and weaknesses. And what really matters is, well, what do they study? Conflict theorists tend to focus on power overall when it comes to what is the conflicts people are having in society. Ultimately, those conflicts are over power. And the other kinds of conflicts they have, like over money or political office and things, those basically come back to the question of who gets to be in charge or not. And so conflict theorists are very interested in what is power, who has it, why do they have it, how did they get it? What about the people that don't have power, why don't they have it, how are they going to go about getting it? And related to the whole idea of power is the idea of ideology, as we're going to learn later in the class when we talk about conflict theorists. Ideology is a tool powerful people use. They're belief systems that powerful people create to try and persuade the people without power that things are the way they should be. If you think about our society right now, for example, if you ask in America, well, why are some people have all this wealth and power that run our society? And a lot of us don't. A lot of us feel like we don't have a whole lot of power. And is there an ideology? Is there, if you ask the top people, like Donald Trump, well, why should you get to be president? Why are you a billionaire? And all I am is a poor college student. Would he give you an answer that would try to make sense and say, well, this is how it's supposed to be. This is just the way things are, because that's what ideologies try to do. They try to make it seem like that's just how it has to be. So is there some answer the powerful people give in America about why powerful people are powerful and powerless people are powerless? Huh? Money. So yeah, he has money, but if you ask, well, why does he have it and I don't?
He works harder.
He works harder. In other words, our official ideology in America is hard work is what gives you money and power, and the people who are up top are people that worked harder, smarter, tried more, and if you're down there, you must not be trying hard enough or working hard enough or smart enough. And so that's the ideology we give. What Donald Trump never would say is, I'm rich because my dad was rich. He wouldn't say that. He wouldn't say, well, I inherited a bunch of wealth from my dad, and actually I lost a lot of it. He doesn't say that. He says, rich people are smarter than you, and they worked harder. So that's why we're up here and you're down there. But what I am more of a conflict theorist, and I tend to look at that as just ideology and say, well, I know a lot of people that work super hard and get nowhere in American life. And a lot of the people I went to college with were very wealthy people that are inheriting lots of wealth, and they're going to get to be top dogs, and I know that they're not very hardworking people or very smart. So in my own experience, that's not what makes some people be at the top of America and some people be at the bottom, but it's an ideology we hear a lot. Anyway, that would be one example of an ideology that powerful people use to explain why they're powerful and up top and you're down there. But there's a lot of different kinds like that, and conflict theorists are always trying to look for who creates ideology, how do they create the ideology, how do they spread the ideology, how do you try and poke holes in the ideology or get people to see things a different way. And ultimately what conflict theorists are interested in is radical change. Radical, by the way, means roots. I mean, now we're going from biology class to math class. In math class, you've probably seen the square root symbol, and that's often called a radical symbol because it's going to the roots. And so conflict theorists tend to be people who believe if you really want to change society, you got to pick it up by the roots. You got to find the roots of that society, pull it out, and plant new roots if you really want to change things. And so, again, as we're going to learn, conflict theorists think our system is a capitalist system, and if you really want to make things different, you have to change capitalism into something other than what it is. That's radical change. And oftentimes, conflict theorists and functionalists disagree over how much change is required to improve things. Functionalists, as more machine-thinking people, tend to think if you just fix a part, sometimes there's a part in the machine that's not working. And you got to fix that part, or you got to change out that part. But you don't need to get a whole new car. If the car is not running smoothly, you take the car to the mechanic and you fix the part that's wrong with it. You don't just junk it and go get a whole different kind of mode of transportation. But that tends to be a big difference between these two perspectives. Is conflict theorists feel that radical change is normally what's needed to create major change in the society, whereas functionalists are more looking for what tweaks you can make, what little fixes you can do to make things better in society. And again, it has to do with their overall difference. Conflict theorists tend to be people who come from groups that don't have a lot of power in the society. Working class people, non-white people, women are often drawn to this more radical perspective on things. Functionalism tends to come more from the perspective of those who already have power and maybe don't want that to change much. And so they tend to focus on institutions, as we were talking about. If you want society to run smoothly and run like a machine, you want to be aware of what all the parts are and what their functions are in the overall system. And functionalists are often talking about these different institutions. How can we get our government to function more smoothly? Our education system, our military, our families. And they're often trying to figure out how these different institutions are linked. Like, how are problems in the family affecting problems in the education system? And how can we try to fix both? What policy changes can we make, or other interventions can we make that would help families function better and help schools function better? And so functionalists, they don't usually look at the overall context, like who has power or not. They're just trying to figure out, well, how do we get the institutions to work better and work more smoothly? Related to that idea is social solidarity. We mentioned Durkheim's interest in this idea. We started with his view of suicide being the result of too little solidarity. When people are not connected enough, they don't prevent each other from committing suicide. He also pointed out sometimes the opposite can happen. You can be so connected to other people that you're willing to kill yourself because of them, like a soldier throwing himself on a grenade to save his buddies. That too comes from solidarity, maybe a little too much solidarity. But it can also happen from too little. When you're not connected enough to people, you're not willing to help them, or you feel isolated and you might commit suicide. But in general, what functionalists would say is institutions aren't going to run smoothly if the people in them don't feel solidarity with each other. For example, one reason our schools often have problems in America is because the children in the school have a different background and a different sense of themselves than the teachers. If the teachers are middle class and white, for example, and the kids in the classroom are working class students and they're non-white, then they might feel not a lot of solidarity with each other. Teachers may look down on students, think of them as not good people, not from good families, and meanwhile the children feel they're being looked down on and judged by the teachers, so they don't want to work hard for them. So you get conflict in the classroom. And a functionalist generally says conflict is an abnormal thing. If societies have conflict, that's a sign that the society isn't working right. If a family has conflict, the family isn't functioning right. If an education system has conflict, it isn't functioning right. So you got to figure out what makes it function better. And it's that solidarity when people feel connected to each other, when they want to help each other, when they want to see the others do well. That's when things like schools work well, and families work well, and teams work well. But when people feel conflict with each other and don't trust each other and don't feel connected to each other, that's when these institutions aren't going to run too smoothly and aren't going to work very well. So functionalists, in their interest in institutions functioning smoothly, are very interested in social solidarity, and ultimately they're interested in social order in some ways. So where they're interested in changing society radically, functionalists will kind of want to keep things running smoothly, keep things as they are, maintain the status quo, it's sometimes called. I put reform here because at most that's what a functionalist might say. We might need to fix things a little bit, tweak things here, change things there, but not revolution, not radical change, but small-scale reforms, not major overhauls. And so again, those two viewpoints are like opposite sides. They're very similar in that sense because they're looking at the same things but looking at them in opposite ways. Whereas symbolic interactionism is, again, kind of off in a different field altogether from those two. Ultimately, symbolic interactionists are interested in culture. We talked about structure and culture. These two sides are much more interested in who has what and distribution of those goods and people conflicting over them. Whereas symbolic interactionism is more interested in the other side of structure and culture, the who thinks and feels what. Where do people's thoughts and feelings come from, and how does that guide their action? And communication is a big part of that. So things like movies and music and language and all the ways that people communicate through symbols. Writing is one way, speaking is another, your clothing, colors, all kinds of ways we communicate through symbols. And that's what symbolic interactions focus on. And they say that really what we consider to be reality, what human beings think is real or not, like just a second ago when I was saying, are we really having class right now? Did you really see the person fall? Did you really fall or not? A lot of that is a matter of the reality we construct. We create a sense of reality. When you pretend you didn't see the person fall and they pretend like you didn't see them, we're creating a reality that isn't actually true, but it's a reality we live in. And in a lot of ways, symbolic interactionists say the reality human beings live in is one they've created. not one that nature or something provided or created. And we're going to see this later when we talk about race and gender. Race and gender can certainly be looked at from a conflict theory perspective. There's a lot of conflict between the races and genders in our society. And you could certainly talk about trying to make our institutions run more smoothly and involve more non-white people and non-men, males in them and things like that. What's interesting though is to take two things, race and gender, that we think of as nature. We think of them as just coming from genes. You just have a race and a gender. But symbolic interactionists argue that those quote-unquote realities are also constructed realities that are created through culture and communication. So when we get to race and gender, or when we get to symbolic interactionism, we're going to use race and gender as two topics that help actually illustrate this way of looking at society, this symbolic interactionist way. So hopefully you're starting to get a sense of how these different perspectives are similar but different, and the ways they differ, and the different things they focus on. Your textbook also brings up some other types of sociology, and I don't think they're that different from these main three types. I think you can just plug them back in to one of these three types. I wrote feminism wrong on here. It should, there's an extra I here, or this I should be here. It should be ism, not sim. But anyway, feminism is a form of conflict theory that, as you might imagine, and we're talking here about not just general feminism as a political movement, but feminist sociology as a type of sociology. And as you might imagine, it focuses more on the conflict between the genders and more on what does society look like from the perspective of a woman. In fact, many feminist sociologists would say women should even do sociology different than a man. For example, male scientists tend to like to control things, like control the guinea pigs that they're cutting open and ripping apart, or control the subjects in a study that they're telling what to do. And a feminist scientist, some of them say, that's not the natural way for a woman to do things. Women are more equal and relational, not trying to control somebody. So for example, when we talk about ways of doing sociology, one way is to do a survey, to try and ask thousands of people to fill out your survey when you force them to answer certain questions on a survey with forced choices. Some feminist sociologists see that as a more male-dominated way of doing sociology, whereas they, as feminist sociologists, would be more interested in talking to somebody, interviewing somebody, getting to know them, getting to get in depth with them as a fellow person, as an equal, not as just a subject of my study. So anyway, feminists say women do have, it's like a different way of understanding the world than men do, and so therefore they have a different type of sociology than men do. May or may not be true, but my point is it's a type of conflict theory in that it's highlighting conflict between men and women. Radical sociology is a type of sociology that tries to take account of all three types of conflict: class conflict, race conflict, gender conflict, and to try to understand how all three intersect. There's a new term you'll hear a lot these days in social science, intersectionality. This idea that you can't really understand my identity just by talking about my race, or just my gender, or just my class. As human beings in America, you can see that power, for example, isn't just held by men, it tends to be held by white men, and it tends to be held by white upper class men. And the most powerless people in our society tend to be women, but they tend to specifically be non-white women, and they tend to be non-white women from the working or poor classes. So you can't really understand power without taking into account gender, race, and class, all three together, and how they shape who somebody is and where they fit in the society or where they stand in it. And so radical sociology is a type of conflict theory. It's just trying to take account of all the major types of conflict in our society. So I put it there as not a totally different kind of sociology, but as one of the variants, one of the related perspectives of conflict theory. Rational choice theory, I don't have a whole lot to say about. In fact, I just kind of plug it in there because your textbook mentions it. But in my mind, rational choice theory is the same as economics. If you ever took a class in economics, economics and sociology differ in a lot of ways. One of the main ways is economics assumes that human beings are born rational, that we come out of the womb wanting to maximize how rich we get and minimize how poor we're going to get. So they assume economics that we all want to be really rich and we don't want to be poor. And that's our main thing in life. And so that you can build your whole model of society according to economics based on the idea that people are rational creatures trying to maximize their gain and minimize their cost. We mentioned Weber talked about rationality, but as he points out, it's a specific cultural trend in our society today from the last few hundred years. He doesn't see it as just a basic thing about how human beings are. Anyway, my own feeling is if you think human beings are at root rational creatures that are trying to maximize their selfish gain against others, then you're not really a sociologist, you're an economist. Sociology argues that human beings are social, first of all, that there is no such thing as an individual except in society, that there never was a man in the state of nature. That's what economists always like to talk about. Some man, when he was in nature, before there was society, when man was all alone in nature, and in sociology we say, well, that never was. Human beings evolved from monkeys, and monkeys live in groups, and human beings are social creatures, so we had evolved to do what's right for the group, not what's just right for ourselves. So I'm not, you can tell, I don't buy into rational choice theory, and I don't think it is a sociology. I think it's economics. So I don't know why your textbook even includes it, but that's all I'm going to say about it. I guess as a type of sociology, it's the most conservative, so it fits with functionalism. Postmodernism is a word we're going to use quite a lot this semester, and we're going to use it in confusing ways. So because it'll contradict itself kind of, or not, it'll be different. So I want to refer to this as postmodernism number 1, because later on in the class we're going to talk about postmodernism number 2, and I want them to be distinct in your mind as two different meanings of the word postmodern or postmodernism. So we are talking about postmodernism number 1. And the basic essence of this viewpoint, it's a type of sociology, and it's a type of symbolic interactionism. What it focuses on, though, is how media technology has changed social interaction. And that nowadays interaction takes place more and more through media technology. It has to do with the reproduction or the construction of reality, we'll call it. Construction of reality through media images. And when I say media, I don't just mean TV and movies. That's like entertainment media. But media means medium of communication. So when we communicate through email, that's media. When we communicate through social media, that's media. When we communicate through TV cameras and broadcasts, that's media as well. But what we're talking about here is communication. And today, communication is often mediated by technology. In other words, what media really means is you have two individual, and they're communicating, but it's through a medium. If we're directly communicating with each other, well, the medium is language. Or if we're communicating through sounds, or whatever, then it's direct communication with sound. But more and more, there's a medium involved, whether it's email or cameras or videos or satellites or whatever it is that mediates the communication between people. And so postmodernists are sociologists who say nowadays, if you want to understand people's interaction, you really have to focus on media technologies. Let me give you an example. A key idea from postmodernism, and this is going to segue into my next point. A key term for postmodernism, so I'm still talking about postmodernism, and a key idea that your textbook mentions in chapter 1 and that we can elaborate on here is the idea of a simulacrum. That's a word you probably never heard before until you read it in chapter 1. It's a very old Latin term, but what it means is a copy of a copy of a copy with no original. In other words, it refers to the endless reproduction of images in our society. And to get really old-fashioned here, you may know that Christianity, one of the 10 commandments of Christianity is don't make images of God. You're not supposed to make pictures of God. That's one of the 10 commandments. People do it all the time. There's all kinds of pictures of Jesus all over the place. But according to the 10 commandments, you're not supposed to make pictures of God. And why aren't you supposed to make pictures of God? Because the term they used back then in biblical times was that would be a simulacrum. You'd be making pictures of God, but nobody knows what God looks like. So if I copy your picture of Jesus and he copies a picture of Jesus and we have endless pictures of Jesus, but nobody ever knew, nobody now knows what, and Jesus maybe is not a good example. God himself is somebody no one's ever seen. By the way, Jesus is often depicted as white, and if he was in the Middle East back then, I doubt he was white-skinned. So that's an example of somebody, an image that got reproduced and reproduced over and over, but was the reality of the reality? Was there really a white blonde guy named Jesus in Israel back then? I don't think so. But, but same with God himself. In the Old Testament, they say you're not even allowed to say God's name. You couldn't say it if you knew it, but don't even try to say it. So people just use the word Yahweh, and that's supposed to refer to the name. If we knew God's name, we would say it, but we don't. So you're not supposed to say God's name. You're not supposed to draw pictures of God. That's all about this idea that when you reproduce images of things, they become the reality. And people start worshiping those images. Another thing from the Bible was the golden calf. You know, Moses said to the people, don't worship things that aren't God. And there they are worshiping the golden calf. And that was a sculpture. That was like a golden statue. And they're like, yay, golden statue. So this is the idea of the simulacrum. Don't worship images. Don't worship, try to get back to the real thing. But in our postmodern world that we live in nowadays, where things get recycled in the media over and over, we tend to live in a reality of images that are copies of things, not actual real things. And I don't know what examples you can think of in your mind of ways that people's lives are copies of things that are from the media, but even those things in the media are copies of other things that were in the media. I like to use the example of a gangbanger. Some guys like to think that they're gangbangers. Some really are. Some think they are. But a gangbanger, if you see a guy trying to front like a gangbanger, what kinds of things might he do to front like a gangbanger? If he's trying to think about how to dress, for example, he might copy things he's seen. So this gangbanger's style might be a copy. What it might be a copy of? Where would a young 12-year-old, 13-year-old kid get his imagery of what a gangbanger is supposed to wear? Would he wear what I'm wearing? No, that's what a professor is supposed to wear. What? Maybe off the internet, or more likely, I don't know, today, maybe I'm out of touch. But in my day, music videos were one place where you would see like gangster rap. You go see like, NWA or some gangster rapper rapping about being a gangster. And you like the way he wears his bandana across his head. So you start wearing your bandana across your head that way. And where did Tupac Shakur, where did these guys get their ideas about what a gangster is supposed to look like? They're trying to front like they're tough guys too in the videos. And sometimes those are copies of a gangster film. Like you can see some videos are like little mini Godfathers or Scarfaces or Goodfellas or something like that. And so the music video is a copy of a gangster film. And what's the gangster film come from? Well, the granddaddy of them all was The Godfather as a movie. And what was it come from? Well, it came from a novel called The Godfather. And where did that came from? Well, that came from Mario Puzo's head, this author, his imagination. There never was a real Don Corleone who was the Godfather, but there was a book about him and a movie about him. And then people make videos based on the movie they saw. And then some kid shoots your sister because he thought he was Don Corleone. So somebody really died. Your sister really got shot. But in some ways, all of this fronting was based on copies of media recycled images. And there never really was a Godfather to begin with. So that's one example, maybe, of the reality people live in sometimes is more a reality of media imagery and media circulated images of what's tough or whatever it might be. I'm sure a lot of women can attest to trying sometimes to make their bodies or their style fit something they've seen in the media. But then oftentimes in the media, those aren't even real either because the girl has been airbrushed. Or the picture you see in the magazine is never what a real person looked like. And yet there you are trying to make yourself look like the picture. And the picture doesn't look like the real person. And so those are examples of simulacra. That's the plural. We have many simulacrums. They're simulacra. So that's a kind of postmodernism. That's what they're interested in. Well, I said I was going to segue because we can take the example of gangs. Gangs are a common thing that sociologists study. And gangs are a serious issue in Yuba City and Marysville. So it's the kind of topic that if we're doing sociology in this community, it's something we should be thinking about. But we could use the topic of gangs to illustrate the similarities and differences of these different perspectives. And I told you when they asked me on the phone which one I was, I didn't really want to identify as any particular one because I can see when it comes to something like gangs that it depends what question I'm asking about gangs. But sometimes functionalism is really helpful for understanding gangs. Sometimes conflict theory is really helpful. Sometimes symbolic interactionism is. So let's try to think of if we were going to look at it from a conflict theory perspective. What do you think a conflict theorist might point out about gangs? Like, for example, if your question was, why do gangs exist? I mean, why do some communities have gangs and some don't? Like Yuba City and Marysville have quite a bit of gang activity. Where I come from, Santa Barbara, California, we have some guys that think they're in a gang, but I don't think we really have any serious gang problems in Santa Barbara, California. So a good question for a conflict theorist to try and address would be, well, what kinds of factors might explain why young people join gangs in a place like Yuba Sutter, but not a place like Santa Barbara County? What kinds of things might they focus on?
Wealth of the community.
Okay, so one thing, maybe it has to do with poverty. Maybe one thing that explains gangs is communities where people are in poverty are places where young people feel the need to join together in groups. Why don't they do that in more middle-class communities? Well, maybe in middle-class communities where people feel like they have access to things like education and jobs, maybe they feel like I don't need to join a group of guys to get power. I mean, maybe it's about power. In poverty-stricken communities, people tend to be powerless. In poor, powerless communities, people feel like, well, I'm not going to be able to go get a good education. I'm not going to be able to get a good job, so that's not my route to power. How am I going to get power? Well, maybe if I hook up with some other guys like me that are also powerless, maybe as a group, we're going to have a little power. And maybe we're going to have power by being oppositional. Some people refer to gangs as what's called oppositional consciousness. They feel like the cops are against them. The cops are in our community to control us and put us down and keep us poor and powerless. So I'm against the cops, and I'm against their laws. These laws, they say, are to help society. Well, they help them and the powerful people, but not me. So why should I obey their laws? Why should I obey their cops? I got to find the guys that are on my side, my homies, my crew, my team. So a conflict theorist might have a lot to say about why young guys in marginal communities. They might bring up what's called multiple marginality. It's not just that they're poor, they're non-white, they might be immigrants or from immigrant families. If you find yourself on the outside of society, on the margins, you're not the center mainstream type, you're on the margins. And you're on the margins in multiple ways. Poor, young, non-white, immigrant. Then you're locked out of power in multiple ways. So maybe guys turn to gangs because it promises to give them the power that they're locked out of by being poor, non-white, immigrants. And it is interesting to note that every immigrant group that's come to America when they first got here, the young people joined gangs. The Irish, they first got here, gangs. Italians, they first got here, gangs. Jews, when they first got here, gangs. You don't see a lot of gangbangers running around with yarmulkes anymore. Do you? Do Jewish kids join gangs? Not anymore. They did at one time because they were at one time poor immigrants new to the community, and their children joined together with other kids like them and made gangs. Nowadays, where do you see the gangs? In communities with immigrants, poor, immigrant, non-white people, people who are locked out for the time being. And the more that they become mainstream, the more they give up gangs. So there's a lot conflict theory could say about gangs. But what about functionalism? If you go ask a cop why there are gangs in America, they probably are not going to give you the conflict theory answer. They're probably going to give you more of the functionalist answer. And so if I could, so looking here at functionalism, anything in their institution, in their foci, and their metaphor that might lead you to the kinds of things that would be interesting to talk about in terms of gangs. What institutions might be not functioning well? Institutional dysfunction you might look at. If institutions aren't working well, then maybe that explains why we have this crime problem of gangs. But which institutions? Which one do you think a functionalist might look at? And if you asked a cop, cops would say that. It's breakdown. It's institutional breakdown. It's American society breaking down. That's why we got gangs. But which ones would the cops point to as being the institutions that are crucial?
Prison?
Maybe. Some people point to the prison system as being part of the problem, that adult gangs are in the prison system, they're locked up, but they still want to make money, so they call the shots on youth gangs on the street, and they tell youth gangs what to do, and then when people go to the prison, that's where they meet other members, and so maybe it's the prison system's functioning or malfunctioning that's coming out onto our streets. And certainly it's not surprising. There are certain cities where the prison system lets people out. Like that's where they always put them when they're being transitioned back out into the community. Like Long Beach, where I used to live, was a place where that was one of the places the California Youth Authority and the California prison system would try to, put people back into society. So there were a lot of halfway houses and things like that. Well, Long Beach is also known for its gang problems. So you might be something to that. What other institutions might not be functioning well? Schools, the education system. People would point to that and say, well, when schools aren't doing the job and people don't feel like they're getting what they need, or they're not being engaged, or they're being looked down upon, or the teachers aren't good, then people drop out and they find other ways of making it in America, and they join criminal gangs and stuff like that. There's another one that you'll hear cops talk about more. If you ask, why does a young man want to join a gang? What would a typical high school social studies class or a cop say? What's a common reason, mainstream reason you hear about why young boys feel the need to join a gang? Their family breakdown. Some people refer to gangs as surrogate families, meaning for young men that don't have a father around or don't have a stable family life, that a gang serves the functions that a family should serve, that a family is supposed to be getting your back, it's supposed to be protecting you, it's supposed to be giving you people that look up to you and respect you, it's supposed to be giving you money so you can live. And if a family's not providing those things, then maybe young men turn to other groups of people that promise to give them that. So certainly the idea of gangs serving family-like functions is a very functionalist way of looking at what a gang is and what it's doing. And it like a functionalist doesn't really look at the larger picture here. Well, why are there more family breakdown in poor communities? Why is that going on specifically? You don't see children of divorced families in rich communities joining gangs usually. So you can have family breakdown in wealthier, whiter communities, but not necessarily gangs. Anyway, but that's a common thing for functionalists to look at. They might also bring up just the whole point of social solidarity, that too many young people are growing up in America not feeling tied to American society. They feel shut out, they feel looked down upon, they don't feel pride in America and its culture and its neighborhoods. So then they take pride in other things like La Raza or whatever it might be. And so functionalists might say we need to get young people to care about the right things, the right values, to value American culture and American society, not value their homies or things like that. So that's a functionalist way of looking at things. What about symbolic interactionism? Is there any symbolic interaction going on with gangs at all? Can you think of any ways that gang members, gangs, use symbols to communicate?
Tagging.
Yeah, there's really hundreds of examples. So graffiti is one way. And then you even use graffiti to comment on the other guy's graffiti, like cross out their graffiti or do other things or use different letters than they use or different colors. What other things besides graffiti?
Colors.
Colors. What colors you wear? Are you red or are you blue? Or what is your gang color? What else? My hand signals. What kinds of hand signs am I doing? What else?
Tattoos.
Tattoos are a big thing. When I worked for the Pentagon, I think I mentioned this, they were trying to find a way, how can we screen out gangbangers? How can we keep them from joining the military? And one of the main ways they do it is, or wanted to do it, was through tattoo identification. If you could have the guys strip down when they're trying to join and look for their tattoos, what do you think might be the problem with that? Everybody's got tattoos now. It used to be a symbol of something, but a lot of guys have tattoos. And a lot of guys even use gang tattoos. Like just because a guy has a spider web on his elbow, that doesn't mean he killed somebody. Or just because he has, laugh now, cry later, doesn't necessarily mean he's in a gang. And so but anyway, that's a very common form of communication among gangbangers. So, and certainly, and another thing we could say about gangs is they are constructing a reality sometimes through fronting, pretending to be tough, pretending to be, a scary guy, pretending to be loco. Oh, you got to think I'm crazy. Are they really crazy, or do they just want you to think they're crazy? Are they really tough, or are they looking tough? And so, what I'm trying to show, I don't know if you're with me, all of these perspectives have something interesting, some light to shed on a topic like gangs. And they all have different foci of what they're looking at. And certainly you can use sociology in different ways for different purposes. And again, it just depends on your what your question is. If you want to know why an individual joins a gang, maybe functionalism would help you understand what functions that individual is missing in their life. But if you're trying to understand why some neighborhoods have gangs and others don't, you can't try to answer that by looking at individual people and their motivations. You'd have to look more at the structure of society and the conflicts over resources. And on the other hand, if you want to understand the effects of gangs on people and their identity, you might look more at symbolic interactions. All right, I'll let you go, and we'll come back to what is sociology on Wednesday, but I think we're about ready to move on to conflict theory now. And so I'm going to post these notes online, and we're going to move on.